You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Healthcare professionals can lead their careers with LinkedIn. Discover jobs by specialty, preferred shifts, and even desired salary. From mental health therapists to radiology technicians, it's now faster and easier for healthcare professionals to find the right fit. Learn more at linkedin.com/healthcare. Side effects may include faster job placement, improved work-life balance, and increased career satisfaction.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 237, North Africa 1940, Part 1, Italian Aspirations. This week, a big thank you goes out to Carter, Chat, Mark, Frank, and Blue for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. Within the sprawling story of the Second World War, there are many contributions from many groups and individuals that are lost to us today. There are also many that are misunderstood, underestimated, or purposefully misrepresented within the histories. I'm not here to do a tier list or a ranking or anything like that, because by the very nature of the contributions, such a list would be impossible to make complete. But on that list, somewhere, are the efforts made by the Italian forces in North Africa. Because this is an asynchronous podcast, I obviously can't do a poll, but I'm going to guess that if I could do a live poll and ask you to name the most important person to the war in North Africa, if you're British, you might say Montgomery, but the vast majority of you will say Erwin Rommel. Rommel will certainly be an important part in our story, but he would not arrive in the theater until February 1941, and the majority of the Axis forces in North Africa would always be Italian. They would do most of the fighting, they would do most of the dying, and they would contribute to every Axis victory in North Africa in important ways. And that's just the 2 years that Rommel was on the scene, because during the second half of 1940, the Italians were on their own in their battles against the British forces that were arrayed against them in North Africa. The Italian war effort as a whole is often looked at very negatively, and they certainly made many mistakes and were at a strategic level completely unprepared for the war that they found themselves fighting after 1940. But when you get closer to the action, there were many Italian units that fought extremely well in some incredibly bad circumstances. Their logistic support, their medical facilities, and their air support was often lacking. Their weapons were rarely first class, and their commanders often failed them in ways that would boggle the mind for any reader of history. But they still persisted, and for almost 3 years they stood up against the major efforts of the British and then the Americans. All of their contributions are largely downplayed in English histories, with their focus on North Africa from late 1941 until final victory in 1943. And the majority of those histories cycle and focus on Rommel and his actions in a way that is almost hero worship, ignoring the contributions of those around him and downplaying the role that Italian forces played in all of his greatest victories. Instead, the Italian forces are used more often as an explanation for the eventual German defeat, rather than for what they were, a crucial source of manpower and troops that made Rommel's actions possible. In understanding defeat, reappraising Italy's role in World War II, James J. Sadkovich would say, quote, "The tendency to attribute Axis success to the Germans and failures to the Italians seems to have its roots in the conviction that Rommel was a genius who could do no wrong, and the belief that the Italians were subject to excessive Latin nervousness and made pitiful soldiers. Far from being made an Anglo-German affair, the North African campaign was Anglo-Italian, and to claim otherwise is to indulge in the sort of bad history that leads to simplistic conclusions regarding the fighting prowess of certain races and the role of morale in warfare." End quote. That's a pretty good quote, and I think a pretty good sort of precursor to what we're going to talk about in this series and in a lot of the podcast coverage of North Africa during these years of the war. Because there would be multiple instances where the Italian forces would be called upon to rescue the Germans from disaster, and one of those examples being at the most famous of North African battles, El Alamein. But this series is about the war before the Desert Fox, before Rommel, as we look at the actions of the British and Italians in North Africa during 1940 and then very early 1941. And that starts this episode with a conversation of Italy's preparations for war during the 1930s, and then its plans for when they entered the war in June 1940, and how the events in North Africa sort of played into those plans. Coming into the war in 1940, there were several structural issues within Italian society that were always going to make a major war a challenge for the Mediterranean state. The first and most important challenge was around Italian industry, which can be broken down into two different problem areas. The first part were the challenges that Italy had when it came to access to critical raw materials required to build and support a modern army in 1940. Oil was by far the largest problem for the Italian military and Italian industry, and it would be the greatest hindrance throughout the entire war, to the point where the operations of the Italian Navy were heavily curtailed during the crucial middle years of the war, specifically due to a lack of oil. The second part of the problem was the problems of modern manufacturing techniques. Italian designers were not bad at what they were doing, and during the 1930s, Italian designs for both aircraft and warships led the world in some aspects. Nations like the Soviet Union would buy Italian ship designs, and Italian aircraft would constantly be at the top of the list of speed records at a time when those kinds of things really mattered. No, the problem was not the designs or the theory behind those designs, but instead the inability of Italian industry to expand their production in a way that other nations would once the war started, or really once rearmament began in the 1930s. The Italians could build things, but slowly. This slow manufacturing was not necessarily a problem during the 1930s before rearmament really got going in other nations. And in fact, during this time, it allowed the Italian military to be considered one of the most powerful in the world. But when faced with the attrition that was suffered during the Italo-Ethiopian War, and then the constant drain of Italian resources that were sent to assist Franco in Spain, Italian industry simply could not keep up with the demands placed upon it. The general problem was that the manufacturers were still more artisanal in nature, able to build really nice machines, but they could only do them slowly, and they were slow to innovate as well. This put them in a position where, of course, they could not build enough of anything, and also in a position where, as the rate of innovation drastically increased in other nations after the start of the war, in Italy, it remained the same. The end result was that as the war went on, Italian technology fell further and further behind. It did not help anything that often the fascist government, led by Mussolini, was so weighed down and constricted by inefficient bureaucracy that even when good ideas and innovations did present themselves, it would only be approved months after it was initially submitted. A perfect example of this is the fact that it took 6 months for the Army technical staff to approve the most straightforward of all anti-tank weapons that was first proposed in mid-1940, the Molotov cocktail. It's the simplest thing there is. You light them on fire. You throw a bottle of flammable liquid at the tank and they catch on fire. Great, awesome. But it took 6 months for that to be approved. This drastic inefficiency made it difficult for manufacturers to know the results of their design changes, and for the army at the front to ensure that their experiences were properly impacting the next design updates made to their equipment. While the Italian industrial base would have many problems during the war, Mussolini never let such trivial concerns as how do we build enough equipment get in the way of his grand plans. But Mussolini was not the only person making Italy's plans, although he was driving the goals at the highest level, which were predictably simple: expand. The details were handled by military leaders like Marshal Badoglio, who would be the chief of the general staff from 1925 until December 1940. In his role, Badoglio would take Mussolini's goals and turn them into something approaching actionable plans, with a series of planning meetings with all of the chiefs of staff of the Italian military services happening in the months before they entered the war. During these meetings, there were at times discussions of the strategic issues that could be caused by certain Italian actions, but they always floated around any actual criticism of the decisions made, but specifically the ones made by Mussolini, because he was always reading the minutes of the meetings. They didn't want that criticism to get back to Mussolini. It should also be said that Badoglio was not great at his job as the chief of the general staff, partially due to his own mindset and abilities, but also because he refused to have a real staff, which meant that there were serious limits to what his office could accomplish because it was so small and it was really focused on just him. This would change after he was replaced, and Marshal Cavallero would sort of change how the position of the chief of the general staff was structured, but this could not really change the overall course of the war by that point. The number one problem that the military side of Italian decision-making could not make up for was the fact that there were simply no clear attainable goals for the Italian war effort that could lead to final victory. This was most apparent in North Africa, where by attacking British interests in Egypt, the only path to victory was to conquer all of Egypt up to the Suez Canal. But the logistical challenges of such an action were immense and should have forced major considerations from Italian planners before they went forward with the campaign. Such a drastic change in course was not possible, though, because the goals were set for the campaign before any of the logistical challenges of fighting across hundreds and thousands of kilometers of desert were really reckoned with. Maybe things would have been different if they simply would have had more time to prepare, but with Italy's ally, Germany, putting together a stunning string of victories in 1939 and 1940, Mussolini was deeply impatient for his armies to also begin their great conquests. This urgency prevented the kind of force and material concentrations that were always going to be required for a successful conquest of Egypt. But in general, this just continued the trend present in all of Italy's war planning, which was built around jumping in way too soon and without real proper preparations. When charting Italy's course into the Second World War, the one common feature was that the Italians were late to just about everything. They believed that the war was going to start later than it actually did, even until relatively late in August 1939. The Italians still did not understand how imminent the German invasion of Poland really was. Mussolini had instead been pushing a message of caution and delay, out of concern that the Italian military was simply not ready to enter into a war. Then, when the war did start, Italy elected to stay out, at least for 1949. The quick and decisive victory over Poland was expected, and then the long, phony war between Germany and the Western powers allowed Italy to remain neutral for an additional 8 months. The Italian leaders believed that there was a real case to be made that their stated non-belligerency during this stage of the conflict was actually a benefit to Germany, making it more difficult for the British to properly blockade German commerce. It was also kind of a pleasant situation to be in, particularly for Mussolini, who had been trying to increase Italian prestige by being the peacemaker of Europe since before the Munich crisis. The British government would approach with various proposals to provide economic goods in exchange for Italy's continued neutrality and even the export of Italian armaments. There were also hopes that Mussolini could play the peacemaker role that he so desperately wanted and broker a peace between the Western Allies and Germany. But eventually all of these plans would fall apart, and the British policy would eventually be to blockade Italy as well, particularly the transport of coal, which was relatively easy to blockade and absolutely critical, not just to Italian war preparations, but just to Italian society as a whole. The American president, Roosevelt, would also get involved with Italy, attempting to convince Mussolini that prolonged neutrality so that the economic sanctions could be lifted was the best course of action. But at the core of Mussolini's plans was the belief that war could be used to benefit Italy's position on the world stage. if it entered at the right time and for the right price. The challenge was that, above all else, Italian forces needed time to come onto a war footing if they were going to be useful and seen as a legitimate force in the conflict. The German successes against France caused problems. The Italians thought they had time, that the war would be long, and they would have time either to convince the sides to negotiate using Italy as an intermediator, or to prepare the Italian military to join the conflict in a later year. Then those pesky Germans had their great successes in France, and it appeared that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. This forced the Italian hand, because the worst possible outcome would be for the war to begin and end without Italian participation, and therefore without an Italian presence in the peace negotiations. And so, on June 10, 1940, Italy entered the war against Britain and France.
Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight?
Aha!
Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
I am so excited for this spa day. Candles lit, music on, hot tub warm and ready. And then my chronic hives come back. Again, in the middle of my spa day. What a wet blanket. Looks like another spell of itchy red skin. If you have chronic spontaneous urticaria or CSU, there is a different treatment option. Hives during my next spa day? Not if I can help it. Learn more at treatmyhives.com.
Given its position and its general lack of access to critical resources, the most important thing for Italy in June 1940 was not to get embroiled in a long war. Two of those critical resources were coal and oil, both of which were basically required to prosecute a war in the mid-20th century. For the armaments industry, coal was required to run the factories, and the shortage of coal would cause Italian industry to be essentially paralyzed by mid-1941. Oil was in a similar place, with the Italian Navy being a critical consumer of oil and the shortage of oil having important ramifications on the ability of the Italian Navy to participate in a war at all in the Mediterranean. More important to our story for these episodes is another major shortage faced by the Italians: merchant ships. For any nation attempting to support campaigns overseas, merchant shipping was critical, particularly in the Mediterranean, where the dangers were everywhere, and some amount of attrition would always be felt among the merchant fleets of the participants. Almost all of the areas in which the Italians planned to fight would be supplied via maritime naval traffic. And oh, by the way, they were up against the Royal Navy, the largest and strongest navy in the world in 1940. To complicate things even further, specifically in North Africa, there was also not a large number of ports that could support the throughput required by the Italian army in North Africa. Benghazi and Tripoli were the two under Italian control, and while they could more than handle the tonnage required in peacetime, when trying to support a military campaign, simply space and unloading speed would be a problem. The lack of transport capacity, both aboard ship and then when it came time to unload those ships, would put the Italian army in a position where they were constantly just a little bit short of supplies. This would cause strain on the forces involved, sometimes heavy strain, but always strain, as not enough equipment was available, or rations were cut short, or replacements did not arrive, or leave back home was unavailable to most. All of the kinds of things that impact the fighting capability of military units in both big and small ways would just be a fact of how the Italian forces in North Africa were forced to fight the war. With all of these issues, the smart move would have been for the Italian leaders to put all their forces into one group and focus on one goal, where they could concentrate their limited resources. If they could do so, then maybe they could bring enough of everything together to achieve a victory over the British in North Africa, or wherever else they chose to concentrate. They did not choose this path, and instead of a concentration almost immediately in 1940, Italy began to spread its resources far and wide in a bunch of efforts that did not really support one another. Most of this dissipation of resources would only come into play after the time period of these episodes, but it's important to discuss them as a way of illustrating the lack of focus that was being placed on events in North Africa throughout the war. The first area where Italian efforts would expand would be Greece, where 400,000 troops would be committed to an invasion that would go horribly. This is just one area of the Balkans, which would be a major drain on Italian resources throughout the war, as places like Greece, Yugoslavia, and other smaller territories were garrisoned by Italian forces up until 1943. While the Italian and German efforts did eventually cause a major diversion of British resources from North Africa to Greece, it was not an advantageous trade for the Italians, and it would have almost certainly resulted in better outcomes if they never would have attempted to invade Greece in the first place. There were also many Italian troops in East Africa as well, almost 300,000 at one point, many being part of the occupation forces of Ethiopia. Here, the Italian forces probably did a good job of diverting British resources, with the British bringing almost 200,000 additional troops to counteract the Italian forces in the region. This included forces like the 1st South African Division and the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions, which would have been very, very useful in North Africa in 1941, when the Italians and Germans launched their first attacks after the arrival of German forces. So not all of these diversions were necessarily bad, but they did spread Italian forces out. And throughout the war, the Italians would end up sending forces to all different kinds of theaters. They would send divisions to the Eastern Front, submarines to the Atlantic, and other areas where the direct link between those actions and the main Italian effort in North Africa were tenuous at best. They were simply trying to do too much with not enough. And speaking of trying to do too much with not enough, the war in Africa would generally be a war of movement, and part of that war of movement would of course be tanks. Tanks at times take on an outsized role in the histories of the Second World War, and it can be easy to assume that they were the most numerous vehicle on the battlefield, given how often they are mentioned and how often they are focused on. But this was rarely the case. And in fact, when tanks performed well, they were almost always part of a combined operation team of armor, infantry, artillery, other support units, other motorized units, all kinds of different groups. And the armored fighting in North Africa was no different. And in some ways, it was the purest expression of pre-war armored doctrine for the Italians and the British in these early days, largely untainted by the earlier events of the war, and on both sides, they would prove to be a bit lacking. For the Italians, they were settled on an armored doctrine that would see them try and spread their tanks out to widely disperse them among many, many units and in relatively small groups. And this prevented the Italians from achieving the kind of mass armor movement that many armies would utilize to great effect throughout the war, and which would be a major component of German successes after their arrival. Another issue for the Italians is the fact that many of their tanks were more correctly classified as tankettes, which were small and lightly armed and armored, which made them mostly useless against a determined enemy, and they were only really good for reconnaissance work. Another issue was, as you might guess, logistical problems, which were not limited to the areas of strategic movement, like with the merchant ships. Italian tank units also did not have enough engineers to repair or dedicated retrieval capabilities if a tank broke down, and the tanks broke down a lot. Tanks breaking down was a plague upon every armored unit in every army during the war, and the best armored forces prepared for this and made real efforts to repair tanks and return them to duty as quickly and efficiently as possible, and the Italians did not. Also, and this is a real head-scratcher when looking back at it from our vantage point today, but is a great example of the kind of decision that maybe doesn't seem like a big idea when the decision is made, but becomes almost catastrophic when it comes to fighting a war and trying to plan to fight a war and support forces fighting the war. The Italian tanks did not all use the same fuel, with their medium tanks using diesel fuel, while the tankettes used normal petrol. adding an additional layer of confusion and difficulty to supply operations that the Italians really did not need. Even with all these problems, the forces available to Italy in North Africa in 1940 were still a major risk for the British. At the time that they declared war, around 225,000 Italian troops were in Libya, although many of these were either on garrison duty or were facing the French to the west. They weren't all facing the British in Egypt. These forces were largely equipped and prepared not for a conflict with Britain and France, but instead the type of colonial peacekeeping operations that the Italians and many other European nations had been doing for many years. This also meant that their ability to launch a major offensive action was limited by their ability to stage logistical support, which would be hampered by a lack of motor vehicles. They could still mount these type of operations, even if they were not as fast-moving as Italian doctrine was really for, but that would require time. And time was a major factor in the early years of the Desert War, because moving anything over hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of mostly desert simply took time. To launch and attack, supply dumps had to be created so that they could be drawn upon for the advance, including not just fuel and munitions, but food, water, and basically everything else that the men needed to fight. Because in other areas, in other theaters of the war, there were at times things that could be found locally. There were supplies that could be drawn upon, or water that could be brought in from natural sources, but all of that was completely absent in the arid landscapes of the North African desert. These issues could be solved with time, though, and it was clear that the Italians probably had that time in the summer of 1940, with the British and French defeat in France, and then the Battle of Britain raging. It seemed to indicate that it was unlikely that the British forces in Egypt would mount any kind of major offensive. And this gave the Italians time, and reinforcements continued to arrive, along with the arrival of part of the Ariete division, equipped with the new Italian M1139 medium tanks, the best tanks available to the Italians in 1940. These would be delivered in July, along with a large amount of fuel and other supplies designed to support a major Italian operation into Egypt later in 1940. When exactly later would be was a hot topic of debate among Italian leaders, with Mussolini wanting it to be soon, while the Italian military leaders in North Africa were attempting to do everything they could to delay and delay and delay as long as possible to allow for greater preparations, which they believed was the only way that they could achieve success. And they could not wait forever, and eventually they would have to attack into Egypt, and they just had to hope that their preparations up to that point were good enough to see them through. Thank you for listening to this episode of History of the Great War, the first in the series on North Africa 1940. I hope you will join me next episode, in which we will look at the British forces in Egypt in 1940, and also the British sort of plan to defend Egypt during the 1930s and how it had evolved over time.